Okay. Okay. For those who were here 2 weeks ago, right before Shavuos, so we did a class where we made what's called a Parsouf. This is one of Rav Ginsburg's greatest innovations, is that he takes a person, an idea, a mitzvah, a word, a concept, and he explains it according to the 10 sfirot. This is a method that he's been teaching for many, many years. And 2 weeks ago, we did that with the giving of the Torah. We went through all of the sfirot in order to show a more global, holistic, integrative look at what Torah is and the experience of giving of the Torah and receiving of the Torah. Last week, as I explained, because we're kind of between holidays and significant events, the next significant event is the beginning of the 3 weeks, where we have 2 fast days sandwiched by 3 weeks. But that's still a ways away. So since it's still the month of Sivan, for those who were here last week, we went through the difference between the prophecy of Moshe Rabeinu and the other prophets, and we talked about prophecy in general. Tonight, we are going to make a Parsouf. A Parsouf literally means a face, but it really means a whole stature. We're going to look at Moshe Rabeinu through the lens of the Sfirot. And this is based on a teaching that Rav Ginsburg gave, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago at his monthly English class on Sunday nights. Some of you probably were watching them. And he made this Parsouf, and I might add a few of my own ideas, but basically the teaching is what he gave over on that night. And anytime you take a personality and you make a Parsouf, it's so enlightening because we see every aspect of the person. And we see that it's far from being black and white, and there's many, many different shades in a person's personality. The human being is a very complex being. And by making a Parsouf, it really gives us a handle on seeing all the different aspects. So we're going to start with Keter. For each one of them, I'll just point it out. We're starting from the top, from Keter, means the crown, the supraconscious. And so Rav Ginsburg said that in the Torah, Moshe is described as being Ish Elokim, a man of God, Ish Elokim. And he said that this description of, in a sense, connecting him to Hashem, to one of the names of God, is this highest level of Keter. And that the Ish, as we'll see later, is the aspect of Yesod. You see, they're in the same line. So this is very, very similar to the breakdown of the word Adam, a human being. The Aleph is for the godly soul, and the Dam, which means blood, is the body, the material part of a human being. And we are a composite of a holy, divine soul and a physical body. So that's very similar to calling Moshe Ish Elokim, a man of God. He was a man. He was a human being. But he was also one of the highest human beings ever to grace this earth. So that's the level of Keter. In addition to that, we've mentioned this a couple of times, that after the sin of the golden calf, so God said, please move to the side and I will destroy the people and I'll make a new people from you. And Moshe defended the people to the point where he said that if you'll do such a thing, wipe me out of the book that you have written. Meaning I will have no part of this. And if you have to wipe me out of your book, then that's what you'll have to do, because I won't be a part of this. So of course, God did not intend to destroy the people, but in a certain way, he wanted to draw out of Moshe this incredible Mesirat Nefesh, his willing to give it everything. So there's an expression in the Talmud from the sages that say that even a casual word from the avot or the imahot will have to come true on some level. So here Moshe is saying, wipe me out of your book. So it's explained that there's one parsha where Moshe's name is not mentioned, and that's V'ata Titzaveh. It's part of the description of building the Mishkan. And instead, God addresses him directly as you, that you should command. And his name isn't mentioned. And so everyone brings this teaching that I just shared with you, the idea that this was how his words were going to be manifest on some level. So he said, wipe me out of your book. So God, as it were, wiped him out of a parsha. But in Khaseedut, they explain something much, much higher here, is that because Moshe was willing to give his entire life for the people, he reached this level of Keter, of the supraconscious level above what's called Tam V'dat, logic and reason. And he reached the level of Keter through his Mesirat Nefesh, is willing to give his everything. So that is the level of Keter. And also at the burning bush, God revealed to Moshe one of the names of God that only appears one time in the entire Tanakh, in the entire Bible, is I will be that I will be. Ekia Asher Ekia. And the numerical value of this name is 543. And Moshe's name is 345, the gematria. It's like a mirror image. And so, of course, Moshe's name backwards is Hashem. So this is the level of Keter, this name that's only revealed one time and really will only truly be revealed in the time of the Mashiach, this name. So these are all different aspects of Moshe reaching the level of superconscious, above logic, above even wisdom, above intellect, to the very source of his soul in divinity. So that's Keter. Then we go to Chachma. Actually, we'll do Chachma and Bina together, because Chachma and Bina always go together. Wisdom and understanding. So first of all, when we did the Parsouf for the Torah, we said that the Torah comes from wisdom. That's the expression in the Zohar, that the Torah comes from wisdom. It reveals wisdom. And so Moshe, who is the vehicle, the vessel to bring down the Torah and explain it to Am Yisrael, so that's Moshe's level of wisdom. Now, the Alter Rebbe said that every Jew has a spark of Moshe. Now, this is very similar to what the Baal Shem Tov taught, that every soul has a point of Mashiach, has a little bit of the potential of Mashiach. And we learned that Moshe is Hu HaGoel HaRishon, Hu HaGoel HaAcharon. He is the first Redeemer, and he will be the last Redeemer. In other words, we always connect Mashiach to David. But we learned that the body and the lower soul of Mashiach is David, and the inner soul of Mashiach is Moshe, is Moshe. So the Alter Rebbe said, so what is this point of Moshe in each person? And he says it's Chokhmah. It's the intellect on the highest level, and that everyone has this point, this spark of pure intellect, and that is the part of Moshe in each person. Along with this, the inner dynamic of Chokhmah, according to Rav Ginsburg and Khaseed, is bitul, is self-nullification. And we know that Moshe is described as the humblest person on the face of the earth. And even with all of his tremendous leadership abilities and the power that he had to lead the people for 40 years, despite so many obstacles and challenges, but on the inside, he was the humblest of people. He was, in relation to Hashem, he nullified his will to God's will. And so that's also, in a sense, the point of Moshe within each person. As we're told in Pirkei Avot, we should make God's will our will. But that takes a lot of bitul, of nullification, ego nullification, selflessness. So this is all Chokhmah. And the one last thing is that Moshe, he gets his name from the daughter of Pharaoh, which she drew him from the water. And in the Torah, it explains that the name Moshe means mina mayim mishitihu, from the water I have drawn him out. And we know from the saying of the sages that anytime it says water in the Torah, it is an allusion, a hint to Torah itself. So when we say that Moshe was drawn from the water, his soul was drawn from Chokhmah, from wisdom. His soul was drawn actually from the Torah itself. So this is all about Chokhmah. Now in the Gemara, it says, Moshe zacha lebina. Moshe merited to Bina. That's across from Chokhmah. Chokhmah is always called the father image, and Bina is called the mother image. And we're told that they're like two beloveds who never separate. So the fact that they don't say he merited to wisdom, it's kind of assumed that Moshe is on the level of wisdom. But that it says that he merited to Bina means that Chokhmah is sometimes described as a lightning flash of clarity and a clear idea. But if it remains just an idea, it doesn't go anywhere. Bina is, in a sense, like the womb, is the mother image that is able to take the seed and create a whole living being out of it. So when it says that Moshe was merited to Bina, was that his wisdom was drawn into understanding, meaning he could fulfill that which he set out to do, that his ideas would find fruition. We also see that there's a whole discussion about if Moshe merited to the 50 gates of understanding. So the Gemara says that Moshe merited to 49 of the gates, but even Moshe Rabeinu did not merit to the 50th. But there's a lot of discussion in Khaseedut showing that in different ways, Moshe did merit to the 50th. And one of the ways that we're told is when Moshe dies, we're told he died by the kiss of God. However we understand that he died with the kiss of God. And some say that's when he reached the 50th level of understanding. And it's interesting because the mountain where it's described that Moshe died, even though the Torah says that no one knows where his actual burial place is until this day, but the mountain is named, and it's Har Nevo. Now you could take the word Nevo and read it Nun Bo. Nun equals 50. That the 50th gate was reached when Moshe left this world. So that's two explanations. And the third comes in the Zohar, where it records Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is having a conversation with the soul of Moshe Rabeinu. In the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he was such an elevated soul that he had communications with people from the other world. And sometimes he could even draw them into this world, their spirit. So he's having a conversation with the soul of Moshe. And Moshe is, we're going to say the word complaining or regretting or pining for the fact that he didn't reach the 50th level of understanding. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, but you did reach it. In the eye of the intellect of your heart, you did reach the 50th level. So what we learn from this is that the 50th gate is not something that you can attain in an intellectual way. Understanding is an intellectual pursuit. But when we reach the 50th level, it's beyond human intellect. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was saying, and this is a teaching for everyone, that there's a certain point of the heart that, in a sense, supersedes or transcends the intellect. And so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was comforting Moshe Rabeinu and saying, you really did, but it wasn't the way that you probably thought that you did. Okay, now we will go to Dat. Dat is the kind of like the invisible one here. That's Dat. Chabad, of course, is Chachma, Bina, and Dat. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Dat is knowledge. So the whole generation that came out of Egypt is called Dor Deah, the generation of knowledge. And why were they called the generation of knowledge? Well, one of the reasons is because Moshe Rabeinu was the Tzaddik Ador. He was the righteous one of the generation. He also, his neshama was a neshama klalit. It included all the other souls. It was connected to all the other souls. And because Moshe was on the level of Dat, and he was teaching this over, like we said, with Chachma and Bina. Chachma is like the flash of intuitive wisdom, and Bina creates we'll call it the embryo, And dat is what brings it into the world. And so for 40 years after receiving the Torah in Sinai, Moshe was teaching the Torah. That's what they were doing in the Midbar. We ended up in the Midbar. It's actually this week's Parsha. Shlach lecha. That's how we ended up for 40 years. And what we were doing is we were learning Torah. And this is the dat of Moshe Rabeinu. Now we're told in a couple more parshas, Parshat Balak, there was a non-Jewish prophet called Bilam. And we're told that even though in a certain way he was a despicable person, for many mysterious ways, he had prophetic powers. And we're told that against this, God has made. There's a spiritual law that everything has its opposite. And so if you have a great prophet like Moshe, so you're going to have also a great prophet, but really from the other side. The reason I'm mentioning this is because Bilam said about himself that he knew Dat Elyon. He knew the higher knowledge. And in a sense, it was true. He was connected in a very, very deep way. We don't have time to go into it now, but Rav Ginsburg explains in one of his books how it is that a person who might not even be a good person can still have prophetic powers. How does that happen? But Bilam was one of these people that he had these powers. He just, like everyone, we have a choice to use it for the good or the bad. So he knew Dat Elyon because Moshe knew Dat Elyon. So that's all to explain Dat. Then we go to Chesed. This is Chesed, and we'll do Chesed and Gevura together. These many times are considered the archetypal opposites in the sphere of Chesed is altruistic, giving, kindness, love, and Gevura is holding back, Tzimtzum, din, judgment, power, might. On the surface, they appear to be quite opposite, and of course they can manifest as quite opposite, but really on the deepest level, they're very complementary, Chesed and Gevura. Too much Chesed is not good, too much Gevura is not good. There must be a balance, and that's usually in Tiferet, which we'll get to. So very simply, Moshe is called an Ohev Yisrael, that over and over and over again, we see Moshe, in a sense, putting up with the rebelliousness of Am Yisrael, of going back to Egypt. His first act really was to defend a Jew who was being beaten. And he saved the daughters of Zipporah at the well. And he defends Israel through thick and thin. He really puts his life on the line going to Pharaoh all the times. So he was just simply an Ohev Yisrael. He loved Israel, and he manifested that in so many different ways. I mean, sometimes we associate Aaron as the greatest lover of Israel. And of course, it's true. It's true. And we sometimes look at Moshe as being more stern or less sympathetic or harder to approach. And some of that may be true, but as far as what he accomplished in his life and what his motivation was, it was totally coming from Chesed. giving. He gave his whole life totally to the people and to fulfill God's will. Now, if we look at Gevura, so that's in a sense much easier. As we said, he kills the Egyptian to save the Jew, and with that he lost being like Prince of Egypt. He lost his whole position. He had to flee, but he did what he did, and he saved the daughters of Yitro, Tzipporah, who he married. He stood up to God for 7 days at the burning bush. Like, that takes a lot of gevura. Going to Pharaoh for 10 plagues and leading the people out. These are all acts of gevura. Leading the people through the Yam Suf and putting up with all of their rebelliousness. This took tremendous, tremendous gevura. And very soon we'll have the story of Korach, where he was really challenged. His whole position was challenged. But here, Moshe did not shrink from the challenge, and he was able to stand up to Korach and his whole group. So now we go to Tiferet, right in the middle. It's usually the integrative power of Chesed and Gevura into Tiferet. And the inner dimension of Tiferet, according to Rabbi Ginsburg and Khaseedut, is Rachamim. Now, we already, in a certain way, described that. Rachamim means compassion. So, of course, it's very close to Chesed and love and deeds of loving kindness. And this was the great motivation of Moshe. He was just full of compassion for the people, even when they sinned, even when they rebelled against him, when they rebelled against God, he had compassion. So Rav Ginsburg teaches a beautiful teaching. He says that every person should have 3 different levels of compassion. One level of compassion is on every human being. That for a soul to come down to a very material, physical, challenging world that is really filled with lots of pain and suffering and brokenness, we should have compassion on every soul that's walking around. Deserves, in a sense, our compassion. Of course, we're told that anyone who's compassionate on the cruel will end up being cruel to the compassionate. There's exceptions for everything, but in general, we should have compassion on everyone who's alive. The second level, he said we should have compassion on every Jew because of our whole history, that and we're not here for the first time. So any Jew who is alive has gone through a real lot and deserves our compassion. And the third level is that we should have compassion on God. As Rabbi Ginsburg describes, if we can imagine how God would want, in a sense, the world to be had he not given us free choice, it's hard to imagine that God is overjoyed with the choices that humanity has made and kind of the world that we have. And so Rav Ginsburg says that we should have compassion on God. There's a lot in our literature about what's called the exile of the Shekhinah, that, as it were, God shares our exile. And God's exile this is not the world that he would choose for us. Now, obviously, God could have made the world any way he wanted, but we're told that being in the image of God entails giving us free choice. And that other than certain miracles that supersede the natural course of the world, God binds himself by the laws that he makes, the spiritual laws and the physical laws, and as well as giving man free choice. So those are the three levels of compassion. And so we've described that this is really the two main traits of Moshe is compassion and what we learned before about bitul, selflessness. And obviously those two go together. But those were Moshe's greatest personality traits, was compassion, rachamim, and bitul, selflessness. Okay, now we go to Netzach. Here's Netzach. We'll do Netzach and Hod together. Even though these are across from each other, it's considered that they are very complementary. And in fact, sometimes when we count the Sfirot, we always try to count the Sfirot that there are 10. So if we count Keter, we don't count Dat. And if we count Dat, we don't count Keter. But sometimes we count Keter and Dat, and we count Netzach and Hod as being one, because they're so complementary. So Netzach means victory and eternity and orchestration. A conductor of an orchestra is called a menatzeach, like in the Tehillim. So this is an easy one because of all of the Sfirot, this is the one that Moshe is most identified with, especially during Sukkot, when we have what are called the Ushpizim, the 7 guests. And Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gevura, Yaakov is Tiferet. Now, Ashkenaz and Sephardi and Hasidus make different associations. But according to Hasidut, Moshe is Netzach, and Aaron is Hod, Yosef is Yesod, and David is Malchut. So Moshe is identified. The 4th day of Sukkot is Moshe's day. It's Netzach. So victory goes very well with Moshe. He's the one who brought us out of Egypt, who was able to, in a sense, obviously it was God doing it, but it's still through the agency of Moshe, defeat Pharaoh in Egypt and bring us through the sea and bring us to 40 years until we were at the entrance of Eretz Yisrael when Moshe passed away. So if you look at his whole life, his mission was he was victorious. Also on the level of eternity, so Moshe is the vessel to bring down the eternal Torah. Moshe emet, the Torah to emet. Moshe is truth and his Torah is truth. And this is an eternal type of truth. And Am Yisrael is called the eternal people. Many people, I think that even their titles of books called the eternal people. And this is coming from the idea of Netzach. As far as Hod, so when Moshe, Hod means glory, acknowledgement, praise, thanks, and confession. It means many, many different things. But we'll concentrate here on the idea of glory, because in last week's Parsha, if you remember, Moshe was at the end of the line. He was like, the burden was becoming too much for him. And he called out to God, I need help here. And so God appointed the 70 elders. And as part of that whole partnership that the 70 elders would now help Moshe, it says, God says, I will take from your ruach, really your hod, and I will put it on the 70 elders. And it says that when that happened, they began to prophesy. Now it's brought down in the Zohar that the sfirot that are most identified with prophecy, and this might come to a surprise to people because we might think prophecy would come from a high intellect or maybe a refined heart. But the Zohar says prophecy comes from Netzach and Hod, because Netzach and Hod is more the intuitive type of understanding. Like in Yiddish, we say, like in your kishkas, you feel something in your inner gut, in your kishkas, is telling you what you should do, what is right, what is true. That's where Netzach and Hod are, and that's where prophecy is coming from. It's deeper than the mind or even the heart. There's a certain place where that you can't even put your finger on it, but your gut just tells you this doesn't feel right, or this does feel right, or the expression this doesn't smell right. So that's very. I mean, you're not talking about a physical smell, but sometimes you walk into a situation and like you just kind of pick up the vibes and you say, there's something wrong here. You can't put your finger on it, but your gut is telling you. So God took from this aspect of Moshe and he shared it with the 70 elders, and they began to prophesy. And even before that, when Moshe comes down with the second tablets, so we're told that his face was shining, and it's called karnei hod, or it's in the Torah, it's called karnei or, with beams of light, beams of glory were just radiating from his face, so much that the people were afraid to look at Moshe. It was such an awesome appearance that people couldn't even look at him. So that's the hod, the glory that Moshe radiated, and why he's coming down with the second tablets, and he is the channel of giving over the Torah. So he's radiating the Torah. Now we go to Yesod, and we already mentioned Yesod in Ish Elokim, a man of God. And so that's Yesod. And Malchut, the final one, this is Yesod, and this is Malchut. Malchut is everything is flowing into Malchut. Malchut means kingship, nobility. And in the last part of the Torah, it says, Vayhi b'Shurun melech. There was a king in Yeshurun. Yeshurun is another way of relating to Yisrael, Yeshurun. It's almost the same letters, actually. So there's two opinions. Who is the melech they're talking about? There wasn't a king in Israel at that time. The first king wasn't for 300-400 years later, the time of Shaul and then David. So they say, one, it says it's referring to God. God is king of the universe. Every time we make a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, so that the Torah is referring, he is the king in Yeshurun. But the other opinion, it says that no, it's referring to Moshe. He wasn't an official king, but for all practical purposes, he was a king. That's how the people saw him. That's how the people related to him. So we've just gone through a whole Parsouf. And again, the idea is just to try to show the many different aspects of Moshe. But in general, it shows us the complexity of a human being and the opposites, and how all the different aspects of a person are manifest, sometimes at different times, sometimes at different times of life, different stages of life, and sometimes all together, that the certain times where we have to combine many of the different, we'll call them sfirot. It's like sfirot to Omer. Just like there's Chesed Sheba Chesed, there's Gevura Sheba Chesed, there's Teferet Sheba Chesed. So also, counting the Omer is talking about us. It's a mirror reflection of who we are. And so every one of us has all of these sfirot within us, has all of these aspects. And so it's actually just a good way to do introspection, just look at ourselves and like, what is my aspect of Keter? What is my aspect of Chachma and Bina and Dat? And am I lacking there? Or am I sharing? What else do I need to do? So it's very much like Sfira to Omer, this idea of making a Parsouf. Okay, so we're going to end with a bracha, and then we will open it up to comments and questions and anyone who wants to share anything. So the blessing is, the Alter Rebbe said, we all have a spark of Moshe in us. And so that means everything that we went through, having this kind of compassion, having this kind of humbleness, having the strength, having the love, all of this is available to us. So the blessing is that we can manifest the spark of Moshe that is within us.